Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a discussion about the importance of getting in a little good trouble now and then. My name is Maria Van Lannen, and I'm the president of Your Fox Cities Performing Arts Center, and we're thrilled to be part of tonight's discussion, which started with a national partnership providing access to the John Lewis movie Good Trouble and a national panel who discussed the importance of engagement in his work on the national stage, all culminating in tonight's discussion about Mr. Lewis's impact locally and the importance of getting engaged right here in the Fox Cities. We all agree that courageous and compassionate conversations will help us build a community where we feel welcome and valued. And we find that often the arts help bring down barriers and provide an opportunity to express the feelings that may not yet have found words. John Lewis said it best when stating, "Without the arts, without music, without dance, without drama, without photography, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings." An important part of engagement is partnerships, and this program exists because of the incredible support of many local community members and Imagine Fox Cities. So without further ado, let's get this discussion underway. It is my honor to introduce tonight's facilitator, Dr. Kimberly Barrett, who is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and the Associate Dean of the Faculty at Lawrence University and a leader of Imagine Fox Cities, including their group focused on belonging. Good evening, Kimberly.
Good evening, Maria, and thank you for that.
Good evening, Maria, and thank you for that.
Well, how is everybody this evening? Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kimberly, we can hear you.
Great, good. I don't know about you, but I need this program tonight. We are dealing with a lot: a pandemic, an economic crisis that is expanding income inequality, and an uprising in support of racial justice. I could use some inspiration. And I can't imagine a better, more inspiring role model for this moment than John Lewis. Mr. Lewis gave us many gifts: his tenacity in the pursuit of justice, the strength he found in love and nonviolence, and something that I think we need now more than any time I can remember in my life, and that is eternal hope. In his wisdom, he even left us a message to be shared by the New York Times after his passing. I think it speaks to the many parallels in the events that inspired him to a life of service and the events we are all experiencing today. In it, he spoke of the inspiration he found in those who are using their power today to make, to make a difference in a society across race, class, age, language, and even nationality to demand respect for human dignity. And the passage in that essay that gives me the most hope in this moment reads as follows: "Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I called good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it's not guaranteed. You can lose it." So tonight, we have a group of diversity warriors who share John Lewis's commitments to change in pursuit of the beloved community. It is my pleasure to introduce them at this time. First, we have Rayon Brown, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at Fox Valley Technical College and involved with Imagine Fox Cities and the Point program. Next, we have Adriana McCleer, who is the Community Partnership Supervisor at Appleton Public Library. She's also involved in many civic organizations, including Imagine Fox Cities and our own Lawrence University's Diversity and Inclusion Community Advisory Committee, and the Fox Cities Performing Arts Center, New PAC. Next, we have Gaochi Vang, She's the Assistant Director of NAMI's Fox Valley's Irish Place program and involved with the Asian American Pacific Islander Coalition of Wisconsin, and is an author of the book, Building Walls to Break Down. Next, we have Karen Nelson. She is the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator in the Office of the Mayor for the City of Appleton. I'm sure that most of you know Karen, everybody does. She's involved with Celebrate Diversity and Fox City's Performing Arts Center's Board of Directors. And finally, we have Morgan Kampel. He's a senior at Appleton East. He is a spokesperson for the Black Student Union, and he's also the president of Appleton East STAR program. Welcome, Morgan, and welcome to all of our other panelists. So we will follow a pretty typical panel format. We'll begin with some brief opening remarks shared by each panelist, and they'll tell us what they find most compelling about John Lewis. Then we will take questions from those in attendance, and the way that you can submit your questions is through the question and answer function. And then finally, we'll come back to our panelists for closing remarks. So at this time, I'd like to invite Rayon Brown to share with us what he finds most compelling about John Lewis.
Good evening. And as Kimberly said, my name is Rayon Brown, and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at Fox Valley Technical College. John Lewis have always been an inspiration to me as a young Black man growing up, understanding the things that he has committed to make a change and to make a difference. What I find inspiring and most influential about John Lewis is his ability to not only speak up, but to also take action and the things that he believes in. He is the driving force behind change. A lot of the things that he fought for have given me the privilege to be in the positions that I am today. And for that, I'm grateful and thankful, and try my best to always figure out a way to get into some good trouble in order to give those that don't have the voice, and to represent those when I'm in a room when they're not there, or even when they're there, and try to create spaces for them. And those are the things that I have witnessed John Lewis doing over the body of work that he have focused on over his lifetime.
Great, thank you. Next, let's hear from Adriana.
Thank you. I've been just so inspired by John Lewis and his relentless persistence and commitment to civil rights justice. So in addition to being an inspiration, his work had such a ripple effect, and inspiring people and empowering people with tangible actions they can take to make a difference in their community and across the nation. So, in the documentary, Good Trouble, there was someone describing John Lewis as someone who always wanted to do good. And I could really relate to that idea. I always want to do good. And normally we associate doing good with following the rules, not stirring the pot, not rocking the boat, and adhering to the standards and norms that exist in our institutions, in our society. And the notion of getting into good trouble, necessary trouble, is really exciting, emboldening, and empowering to me as someone that wants to find ways to make significant change in my community, in our nation. So as we learn more about John Lewis and his legacy for our communities, I think all of us have the opportunity to pursue that good trouble. And as we use race and racism to evaluate the structures and standards in our society, we say that it absolutely is necessary to address those issues, that if we don't stir the pot and if we don't rock the boat, we can't ever create the community that is just and that is equitable for all community members. So we have to take on his relentless pursuit and commitment to justice, and continuing inspiring each other and empowering each other with tangible actions we can take to make that difference.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Gaochi.
Thank you, Kimberly. So if I think about what is the most compelling part of John Lewis, he as a whole is just an incredible human, hence why we are all here. But I think the best part that I have learned about him and continue to learn about him even after he's left us is his humanity. Regardless of everything he's gone through, regardless of all that he has had to go through, he continues to bring light into people's lives and bring hope into the most hopeless spaces and our feelings of not being heard. And I just think that he does it in the most powerful way and in the most human way. I remember watching a video of him dancing to Happy by Pharrell, and it just brings me a smile because it just reminds you of how human we are, that regardless of all the things that we go through, we get those moments to really take it down and be like, we need to do more, we need to be more. However, to not forget to kind of dance through life a little bit and have gratitude for the people around us and love the people around us who give us hope so that we can continue to give hope to others.
Thank you for that. I'm going to have to listen to Happy after this is over. But next, let's hear from Karen.
Yes, so what compels me most about John Lewis is the fact that he was my congressman when I lived in the state of Georgia before moving back to Wisconsin. And I will forever cherish the fact that I marched with him way in the back of 250,000, a quarter of a million people who marched over that Edmund Pettus Bridge that year for the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma, Alabama. And I think I almost took it for granted just how approachable he was. I have had many private moments with him when I was in Georgia, and I can't find a single picture now that I would love to be able to show, because I think I just always took it for granted that he'd always be here, because he always was. I think Ambassador Andrew Young said it best, which is that Congressman John Lewis literally lived his life for us, having been active as a civil rights agent from the age of 18 to 80. He first met Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King when he was 18 years old. He spoke at the March on Washington as the youngest speaker at the age of 23. And then to also stage a sit-in in Congress as a congressman in 2016, just a few short years ago. What a dedicated soul that he has lived his life for civil rights, which is why we must continue his fight in his stead.
Thank you, Karen. And so, Morgan, what do you find most compelling about John Lewis?
Compel me the most about him, the fact that he achieved so many goals and he took so many boundaries. It's something that drove me to have the utmost respect for him throughout his life before his passing. And John Lewis is one of those prominent figures that I have so much respect for, because he's not taught about in a lot of schools. And like when it comes to, let's say, periods like Black History Month, for example, you'll have a couple figures that teachers will focus on, but there are so many iconic Black figures that are extraordinary and don't get the respect they deserve, John Lewis being one of them. And what compels me about him is that he was very genuine in what he fought for. And he was also very bright and wise soul at the same time. Throughout his lifespan, he witnessed a lot. He's witnessed hardships. He's witnessed and dealt with traumas, but he's also witnessed a lot of strength and unity in numbers. And that, especially in this time right now with all of the things we've witnessed throughout this year, from the protests and the movement growing rapidly. And I feel like John's spirit is something that spread throughout the masses, and there's no way that you can't appreciate everything he's done for the Black community and for many other communities as well, as influential as he was.
Thank you. I want to remind our participants that you can ask questions in the Q&A, and we would love to hear your questions. But I do have a question for the panel based on Morgan's comments. He brings up a great point about how missing information really contributes to implicit bias and the stereotypes we have about different groups of people when you don't hear about the great accomplishments of individuals from their groups, and how that then contributes to and maintains structural racism. And so what role do you think learning about, remembering about our history plays in this revolution of racial justice? Because as you might know, John Lewis was instrumental in the establishment of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so why do you think it's so important to learn about this history? And I'll just speak up. Just unmute yourselves and speak up, panelists.
I think to chime in really quick, I think it's so important to know our history because it's to understand ourselves. And coming from a very psychological perspective, that's my area that I love to just dig into deep, is that sometimes in order to understand who we are and our traumas today, we must understand all the generations before us. And to know that before you come into a space that you can heal and that you can use your voice in a genuine, authentic way, you have to understand where that frustration comes from, where that anger comes from, and you have to know what you're fighting for. And I think to have the right people around you too, that understands where your frustration comes from, these are the lights around you, these are your fire around you that allows you, that pushes you to keep going, that reminds you that when you kind of lose your path, they ground you back to who you are, where you come from and your ancestors and things like just basically your roots. And so when we think about John Lewis and all that he's done, it's because of not just in his lifetime, but his family's lifetime, the generations before him, because it didn't stop with them. It didn't stop with him, and it hasn't stopped now. And that is why we are still fighting for a lot of things that we are today. And in order to understand why people are fighting for racial justice and racial inequities and against racial inequities, is because it roots way back to beyond ourselves. And when we understand where it roots from, that's when we can understand why we keep fighting.
Thank you.
I just have something to add to that. Thank you so much for that. And I think Maya Angelou said it best. You really can't know where you are going until you know where you have been. It is critical and it is important for us to know our history as a people so we can honor the vast amount of contributions that we bring to the American society. We need to see people in the complete picture of who we are every day. We need that positive representation of us, and we need to see what we bring to the table and what contributions we have had. And finally, in some situations, I think it's also important for us to understand the past, for us to avoid making some of the mistakes and prevent further marginalization and disenfranchisement of marginalized groups in today's society. If we don't look at history, we are bound to make some of the same mistakes that happen. And growing up in Jamaica, You know, we were always told that a wise man learned from his mistakes, but a wiser man learned from the mistakes of others. So without history, we're bound to keep making the same mistakes and to live in that continuous circle. So understanding our history for both the positives to see what we bring, but also it's important for our history to be present in order for others to realize that the things that we're fighting for today are things that we were fighting for in the 50s and the 60s and even before that. And people need to really study and look to make sure that those same things are not being repeated in 2020 or beyond.
Speaking of before that, I'd like to chime in with a perfect example that just happened last month with the remarkable unveiling of the Women's Suffrage Monument in Central Park. You see over my shoulder here, I'm still celebrating the centennial of the women's right to vote. Well, all of us now know that meant the white women's right to vote in 1920. But even long before that were marginalized groups of women of color that were left out. However, on that day, a month ago now, the monument was revealed in Central Park, revealing the fact that for the first time, acknowledging the fact that Sojourner Truth, being one of the mothers of the women's rights movement, of course, along with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those are the two names that we'd normally hear. But when you see that third person in the African-American former slave of Sojourner Truth, who again, yet another whitewashing of history, has become infamously known for some words she never did say, "Ain't I a woman?" Those words were actually added by a white woman writer, Frances Gage, some 12 years later after she said those remarkable words that she did actually speak in Akron, Ohio, some 12 years earlier. That's the kind of insidious whitewashing of history that must now be stopped in our generation as we go forward, as we force forward because of the strength and tenacity of someone like John Lewis, letting us know we must know our history so we can clean it up and move forward decisively.
Great. Wonderful. So we have a question from Max, and he says, one of my favorite quotes of John Lewis is, "Democracy is not a state, it's an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. What do you feel are some important ways we in the Fox Cities can make democracy an act and can build the beloved community of peace?" That's a big question. Adriana, you want to give that a shot?
Sure. So I'm rereading the last question. Important ways that we in the Fox Cities can make democracy an act and can build the beloved community at peace. So I think we're all in pursuit of the answer to that question. You know, coming together to share our experiences, our expertise, and working together to find a path forward is critical and important, and building a community that is belonging and is inclusive, where people do have the opportunity to share their voice and be a part of their community. So I don't have, definitely don't have the answer to that, but I think opportunities like this, where we're listening to each other, we are taking inspiration from the amazing activists that have worked towards civil rights and social justice, and taking that inspiration together to work towards an equitable, inclusive community.
Yeah, you make a good point, Adriana. This is sort of lifelong work, and we're always moving towards that ideal of the beloved community. And it is an active process. You never get to sit back and say, "I'm done." And in the quote that I used, we talked about voting, and that is an active thing that we get to do on a regular basis. Anybody else want to respond to that?
Yeah, I will come in really quick. I think an act is to show up. Whether it's an event that you're not familiar with, whether you might be the outcast, whether it's because you are afraid to put yourself in a space where you will be the one who looks different. Either way, show up. Show up because it means something. And that does mean show up to the polls or request a ballot so that you can vote. Or it means to show up to events like this so that you can learn beyond yourself, or to show up to events once this pandemic slows down and you can attend things more personally. Show up, because when we show up, we prove to ourselves and to the communities around us that we care, that we are here in solidarity, or we are here to support you. And I think when you are able to show up in those spaces, you are able to build bridges. And that's exactly what we need to do, is to build bridges and meet each other halfway. But we can't do that if we don't show up to each other's events, or we don't show up to remind one another that, hey, like, we hear you, we see you. So in other words, just one way, go vote.
Yeah, I love that. I love that sentiment. Show up for each other, show up to vote, show up to learn. I like that. Show up. We do have another. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add, and also be intentional. You know, one of my favorite quotes from the Good Trouble documentary was when John Lewis reminded us in his own words that victories are temporal. Victories aren't permanent. If that were so, we won that victory with the 15th Amendment, first granting Black men the right to vote, which garnered us and gave us the Reconstructive period for almost 10 years. But then that was removed and replaced with Jim Crow that lasted 80. So stop and think about that. 10 years replaced with 80. Why? Because every generation must pick up the mantle and fight the fight and win it for that generation to move forward. Otherwise, we will go back. But we are talking about going forward, and that kind of encouragement from the lips of John Lewis just gives me all kinds of energy to want to continue to fight moving forward.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Renee has asked. Oh, I'm sorry, Morgan.
Oh, pardon. Yes, I wanted to chime in real quick. Miss Vang made a great point about showing up, as well as Miss Nelson, on John Lewis's quote about victory not being permanent. Like this past summer, towards the beginning of the summer, I believe it was not too long after the protests of George Floyd's death took place. There was an event where I was invited to speak alongside several scholars and pastors in Fox City. And it was my first time speaking at an event that involved such a controversial topic. And I'll never forget how, I believe one of the pastors said it early on, that it was great that everybody showed up. And the most important thing was to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And that quote stuck with me ever since, because in times like this, it's safe to say comfort is something that is either going to hold us back or is going to keep us in place. In order to make progress, we're going to have to get uncomfortable, fighting for change and speaking to people and figuring out ways we can tackle the issues we deal with as of 2020. So those are some things that really stood out to me. And me, naturally, I'm a thinker. I'm naturally not as verbal when it comes to controversial topics of politics. Growing up, I never really got into politics, but I think I'm at a point in time where, like, it's all around me. There's no way I can avoid it. So my best option is just to flow with it and work through it and speak with others, educate myself in many ways possible, and then encourage others to do the same.
That's great. Thank you. Some great advice about how you can work to make the beloved community in the Fox cities. Now, Renee has a question for all of the panelists, and of all of the variables, economic, occupational, education, social interactions, US racial history, and many more, which do you believe is the most critical to address first? What variable, what dimension of our lives do we need to address first in our quest for social justice? Who'd like to take that one first?
I'll start, and I'll try to be brief just to give others an opportunity to also chime in on this question. And for those of you who are on the panel or might be watching that knows me, you might anticipate what I'm going to say. I work in education. So so to me, you know, I've dedicated my life in order to educate people and to give and to create access for our community to access education and to achieve the successes that they need to achieve at the highest level possible at all times. So wholeheartedly, I feel as if our focus needs to be on education, and we need to educate people in all aspects of the word. We need to educate people in order to learn how to collaborate. We need to educate people to learn how to innovate. We need to educate people on the need to be good neighbors and good social citizens. And without education, we will be lost. I often tell my team at work that I will not blame someone for doing something if I didn't take the time to educate them on what it is that needs to be done. So for me personally and professionally, I think we need to put education first at all times. But when we put education first, we need to make sure that it is relevant, right? And it's responsive. And also it have the necessary amount of representation, and education should be an opportunity to get every single person a chance to see themselves at the highest level at all times, not simply a single perspective view of education, but a complete knowledge and complete exposure. Educate people on the arts, educate people to be financially responsible, educate people to be good, caring, loving citizens of this country and of everybody else. Educate people of the things that have happened to get us where we are today. And if we focus on education, hopefully enough of us will learn what to do, when to do it, and how to do it in order to get us to a place where we can all feel a higher sense of belonging and complete well-being in our community.
Great. Well, thank you, Rayon, for that. So we should start with culturally relevant education for everybody. So who else? What do others think?
Well, I'll jump in and share my point of view as much as I totally agree wholeheartedly with what my colleague Rayon has mentioned about education. My mom was a retired school teacher, and I'm covered up on both sides of my family with remarkable educators. I'm going to choose the economy, the economics, jobs. Because the fact of the matter is that despite decades of political change and thank goodness the end of enforced segregation across the South, where I'm from, I am a daughter of the South from Charleston, South Carolina, having lived in Georgia for some time, I mentioned earlier. The fact remains that the gap between the races from an economic standpoint is critical. It's remarkable that current economists have actually most recently confirmed that the average wage for Black men is exactly where it was, statistically speaking, to where it is today. A complete flat line from the 1950s to 2020. That is sad, despicable, for what is supposed to be the richest nation in the country, in the world. And so for me, it serves as just a stark reminder that, quite frankly, what Dr. King was when Dr. King was assassinating, what he was fighting for was beginning to make that pivot from just pure integration and taking down the dismantling of the signs and the Jim Crow era, but rather he was about to pivot into the Poor People's Campaign and really struggling for wanting to pivot the movement toward economic equality. And that's why I would choose the economy.
So we have education, the economy. Anybody else want to weigh in on that before we move on to another question?
Yeah, I'll chime in really quick. So it was not part of in the parentheses, but in my area is mental health. And I think mental health is oftentimes an area or a field that gets dismissed, but everybody has mental health. And sometimes we forget that we all have mental health. And recently, the numbers for Asian Americans and Black Americans, mental health has increased significantly, and mental illness has increased significantly. And so for me, addressing that is critical, because I believe that once you address mental health in communities that have intergenerational trauma, you're able to get to the root of these situations, and you're able to understand these situations and not move on from them, but heal from them, and then understand, where am I going now? However, that being said, I know the question also says, of course, all need to be addressed, but which one do you think the most immediately critical? It's kind of a difficult question to answer, because I think, like you said, Renee, in your question, they're all important. And I think the thing is that we're all in different areas, and we all get to take up space in those areas, and we all get to fight for social justice in those areas, and we all deserve to. So it's not too much about which one should be priority, but which one can we make the most progress with what we have, with the abilities that we were gifted with the potential that we have. And so that being said, specifically for me, it's mental health, because I think everything starts with mental health. And if you talk to me, I will always talk about mental health. So, but that being said, thank you for the question. And I believe that we all can take up space where we can make the best progress, and we all deserve to be there.
I think that's a wonderful point, Gaochi. And we all have areas that we can influence. And if we think about the fact that, we have to do everything at once, it can seem overwhelming. But I think if we all made a difference in that area that we can influence, whether it's mental health or education, whatever it might be, then we could solve these problems. We could create the beloved community, each doing, what we can. And that's, I think, all that can be asked of us. So one area that we didn't choose that is really, prominent right now in terms of people trying to address is this issue of police reform and criminal justice reform. So how do you all think we should best approach police reform, or in a broader sense, criminal justice reform? I'm gonna pick on Karen for that one.
I had a feeling you were going to come straight to me on that, but I was going to wait my turn. But I believe that when it comes to police reform, I think a few communities have gotten it right in terms of going about it or approaching it from the point of community policing. And that's a whole different ballpark, if you will, as opposed to making everything so punitive. What does the police department need to do to engage with the community and not just make it a punitive thing? I have had quite a few stories and situations, of course, that have come across my desk, of course, being in the mayor's office at City Hall. And one of the first things that I had to do as a new resident in the city of Appleton is recognize that the Appleton Police Department is very different from most police departments, because they take community policing really at heart. The fact that they've learned de-escalation even years before I moved in. Are they perfect? No. Do they get everything right? No. Who does? But the fact that they're so intentional on focusing in on the community as opposed to just upholding the law for the sake of the law. I can share something that happened to me. This is probably my first time sharing it publicly. And that is when I was first stopped by a police officer 2 weeks into my job in the city of Appleton. I was driving my navy blue Mercedes, so just to give you a visual, pulling out of Mize Deli onto Richmond Avenue. And the sun had just gone down. My son and I had just picked up dinner. We had just moved in about 2 weeks earlier. And these blue lights come flashing on. And I said, okay, my son was with me. So I looked over to the passenger side. I said, son, are you buckled up? So he was, and I was too. And I'm holding at 10 and 2. And I said, okay, son, quick review. This is the time for me to tell you everything that mommy has ever taught you when you learned how to drive in Milwaukee before we moved to Appleton. 10 and 2, look straight ahead, no sudden moves. Go ahead and reach inside the glove compartment, get out my registration, put it right here so I don't have to remove my hands from the officer's view. Because I'm thinking, surely he's not after me. I'm going below the speed limit. We're all good. But the blue lights continued, so I decided to turn onto Washington or Franklin, one or the other, to get out of the way so he can go on to whoever he's chasing, because it can't possibly be me. It was. So he followed me around the corner, and while I'm waiting for him to come to the window, I continue my review with my son and put down the window so we didn't have to do that when the officer got there. And the officer came to my window and said, ma'am, he didn't even know who I was yet. Do you know why I stopped you? And I said, no, sir, I don't. Meanwhile, my heart's racing. All I could think about was Sandra Bland was literally 2 weeks on to her new job in Texas. What can happen to me now? He said, I'm just pulling you over to let you know that your driver's side front headlight is out. And because of it's a protocol in our city's government and our city policing that we will give you not a ticket, but I will give you a road pass, like a hall pass, to let you get home safely in case one of my other colleagues pull you over for the same thing. They will know that I've already stopped you and alerted you to the fact, and I trust that you will get your headlight taken care of as soon as you can. I mean, my anxiety came way down. And of course, while he's writing up the warning, I mean, the road pass ticket for, or whatever I needed to put in the dash, I turned to my son and I said, son, I would have never seen that coming with a million years. I know nothing like that had ever happened to me in Waukesha or Milwaukee when we moved there too, before moving to Appleton. I share that as a personal testimony to the fact that at least I know that they're working on it. If they don't get it right, if they don't do that every single stop or every single time, I can attest to the fact that that's what has happened to me. And I use that testimony very sparingly because I don't want people to think I'm just placating my employer. But I use it as a real life example of what the difference in community policing versus just, we got to give you a ticket, your light is out, we don't care why, or how things can escalate to some of the more egregious endings that we've seen throughout the country so far this summer.
So one way of dealing with police reform is really focusing on community policing and relationships.
Yes, and de-escalation.
De-escalation. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to chime in on that one? Morgan, did you want to? Or Adriana? Great.
This is not a direct answer to the second question, but what I was thinking about in the previous question about where we need to prioritize our energy right now, and I think it's related to this next question, is around racial literacy and the addressing race and racism in all areas of what we do. So, before we do that, we can't address housing insecurity that disproportionately impacts people of color. Before we see race as a central piece of our society that is creating barriers to high quality education and access to, pathways to education, we're not going to make progress. So I applaud the work that Karen Nelson has been doing with the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, which is something that we're employing throughout the city of Appleton in various departments to be able to look at our policies and the historical legacy, not only of our country and our community, but our own institutions. How have we created and continue today to maintain policies that are racially restrictive, that are restricting people of color at higher rates than our white community members, patrons, and citizens of our community. And I think along with, developing racial equity within institutions and our own local government, there's also an individual responsibility that we have to educate ourselves and become comfortable, as Morgan shared, being uncomfortable and talking about race with our colleagues, our partners in the community and our own family, which in some cases can be the hardest conversations to have, so that we can take individual responsibility and we're not putting that off to diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinators to carry the responsibility for fixing what is truly a societal issue and all of our responsibility.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana, for that. I agree. We can't really tackle any of these issues until we understand issues of race. What is race? What do we mean when we say it's a social construction? And what do we mean by racial equity? And before we tackle those issues, we won't be able to identify what policies are problematic. And so I'm going to do a little commercial here. Several of us are involved with Imagine Fox Cities. And on the Imagine Fox Cities page, there's some guidebooks for talking about race, racism, and anti-racism that you don't need any special training for. You can do it with your family, you can do it with coworkers, with your faith communities, and everything you need is in the booklet. And so, I would say that that is a place to start to understand these basic concepts. Because if we don't, sometimes we're just going through the motions. We're being what we call sometimes performative in this work, unless you really understand these concepts. So thank you, Adriana, for that. Anybody else want to address this? How can we best reform police?
Yeah, I wanted to speak on that. Police reform is a subject that is considered very, I guess, elderly, if elderly is the right word. Me being the 17-year-old that I am, we get told by a bunch of adults that you guys are still growing. You have yet to really grasp a true understanding of how the police system works, but we witness a lot of things. And I feel like police reform is something that we need to be heavily educated about if we want to tackle issues within that category. And I say that because, like, throughout the school environment, that's probably the biggest place where I'll see it, is where I'll hear children, I'll hear like students speak on the police in either really good ways or really bad ways based off the experience they had about them. You'll have kids who they will speak on the fact that, they believe in good cops and they believe in what they call a few bad apples. And then you'll have kids, walking around the hallways screaming, F the police and statements of that matter. And I feel like police reform is something for us to tackle it as a big issue as a whole. We need to sit down any biases and really educate ourselves on how it would really work out and how we should approach it, instead of just like going off the top of our heads or going off of stereotypes and statements you hear from neighboring people, neighboring citizens. And also communicate with people with opposite views from yourselves. I know that's a really big thing that helps as far as going forward, educating yourselves in ways of that matter. So I feel like there's several different ways we can go ahead and tackle police reform, but it'll take a lot of steps to get there for sure.
Definitely. And I think a partnership between those of us who are elderly and young folks like you, I think is the best way to go, as you suggest. And in fact, you know, the same people who made the problem can't always solve it. It sometimes takes new eyes just to see a new approach, that because we've been looking at it so long, we can't see those options. So thank you for that, Morgan. Let's do one more question. And because the person the group putting this together is our Performing Arts Center, let's have our last question be, what is the role of art in social change?
Well, being that I sit on the board for the PAC, I'll go ahead and speak first. There is such an intersectionality of the emotion, the raw emotion, the teaching of the lessons that come out of the arts, the deep emotion, the expression of the togetherness that comes out of the arts community. I am reminded of one of the most significant experiences that I've had since being in the Fox Cities or in Appleton and being on the board, is having been one of the community participants in the bringing the play, the musical, to Appleton.
What musical was that? You cut out for me.
Oh, Miss Saigon. And unlike other communities who have who underwent some severe opposition from their community for bringing the musical to the city, to their credit and thanks to our leadership, the leadership of Maria and her staff, decided to approach it differently in the city of Appleton, to actually ask the community what's their point of view about the play. And also that kicked off a series of community conversations that showed the diversity of the Asian community, that touched on and allowed an in-depth discussion about how that particular musical over the years, over 25, 30 years now, had garnered such negative perpetration of such negative stereotypes of Asian women, but rather taking the time to point out what was positive and really using it as a community learning opportunity over the course of a month that went long beyond just bringing the play to the PAC. That is the beauty of how the arts can help educate, provide an outlet for emotion, but also can bring us together, such as the Motown Christmas, when we're all just up dancing in our seats instead of dancing in the streets. So that's just one example of how I believe the PAC is just paramount to bringing us all together from an art form that also affects us through bringing all of our races together.
Is there anyone else who wants to comment on that before we are going to hear from all of our panelists as we wrap up, and they are going to address one additional question. But does anybody else want to talk about the role of the arts in social change?
Yeah, I'll chime in really quick. Oh,
No,
sorry.
go ahead. You go first.
Okay, thank you. So I believe that the arts has really become a bridge for people to find their safe space. Whether it's music, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's singing, performing. I think that is your safe space to be able to express yourself, to be true to who you are without any criticism, without any judgments, without any like fear of being told like you're too big or you're too much or you're not enough. And I say that because that's something that with my book, I really used it for. And I titled it Building Walls to Break Down because growing up in a small town and being a person of color, you really like, you can really persuade yourself that that you aren't who you are. But the truth of the matter is that you are who you are. And it takes a long time for you to come to terms with that when you're surrounded by people who don't look like you, or you're surrounded by media or representation that does not look like you. And it's really easy to forget who you are. But when you look into the arts, you get to be who you are without the fear that, oh, like you have to look like this, or you have to be like this, or you have to have this specific mindset. So I think when it comes to social justice, I see stars, I see actors and actresses and artists talk about their experiences, and it resonates with so many people who listen or watch a performing act, and you just like, you can feel it. And I think that's where all of our feelings are, and all of our emotions belong in artistic areas, because those are the parts that we get to really just be true to who we are.
Thank you. Thank you. Rayon.
I agree so much. Art is one of the purest forms of authentic self-expression. And throughout history, we have seen where individuals have used art either to document the great change within society, or to use it to help us, to remind us what have taken place, whether it's on the walls, in Egypt, or in the hidden scrolls, wherever it is. We always see art show up in some form, whether it's spoken word, music, or rhythm. You tend to get a high sense of emotion that's invoked through art. And as you've heard, when someone expresses themselves through art, like, you truly get to see who that person is without that added factor of judgment. And the role of social change, right, is to promote understanding and actions and issues facing our community and the wider society. And social change should focus on evaluating and eliminating structural barriers, or create inclusive space to positively influence social conditions around us. And what else can do that in the most creative way and the most free way possible than art, and to give someone the freedom of expression, and to let them use their art to illustrate their feelings, whether it's through song or dance, or with words in a book, right? We have seen where art have played a critical role into moving this fight for social justice along throughout history. And it is one of, I think personally, one of the most important pieces, because we can all be here and we can talk about all of the numbers and the data and all of these things. And until you start to find something that will appeal to someone's emotions, in time, sometimes we might lose them. And art always find a way to appeal and to connect with the human within us. And I think that's what we need to do as we work towards social change, is to continue to use the mechanisms that we have at our advantage and at our disposal to appeal to the human within, our friends and our neighbors and our co-workers, in order to continue to promote the change that needs to happen.
Great, wonderful. The arts help us sort of feel our human connectedness. That's great. So we're going to have each of the panelists, to wrap this up, respond to a question. And since democracy is action, this last question talks about action. And so I would like for each of the panelists to tell us how they are going to call people in to engage in good trouble in their community on a personal or professional level. So we'll begin with Morgan.
I constantly get told all the time that technology is the greatest advantage that my generation has. And I definitely agree with it now more than ever. So with the social media platforms that I have, and I've gotten to the point where I'm really comfortable with all of them. I know how to use them and how to reach out to whether it be people personally or to an audience. I will do my part and continue to do my part by constantly speaking with people and asking them questions, as well as if they need any form of educating. I would love to sit down with them, whether it be by texting messages to them, having video chats with them, or even going on the phone with them. And any events that I get notified about throughout the rest of the year and throughout next year, I'll do my best to get my peers to come out to those events. And that's a really big thing that I want to focus on, is getting kids my age involved in events that resonate towards the subjects we spoke on here. And I'll continue, me personally, I'll have to continue to educate myself on our history, as well as what's going on right now in the political field. And laws, 18, for me, 18 is around the corner. So I know adulthood is going to be a big thing I'm going to have to get into. So there's a lot I have to learn, and I'll do my part there. But as far as the audience and masses go, and with my peers, I'll continue to get them involved and persuade them to speak out on issues and encourage as many people as I can to do the same and get like a chain reaction going.
Great, thank you. I probably need a lesson on using technology to call people into good trouble, but thank you, Morgan. You can give me a lesson sometime on some of those techniques. Next, let's go to Gaochi. And Gaochi, the question is, how are you going to call people into good trouble in your community, either on a personal or professional basis?
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. So when I think about good trouble, it's also troubling ourselves. That is to understand that sometimes I've been taught to make myself small, so that I'm not too loud in the spaces that I do deserve to be heard. And sometimes you have to get into good trouble by stepping out of your comfort zones, by maybe addressing a person of authority, like your boss or like even your parents, your parental units, when you recognize that you have something to say or you deserve to have a voice. So by that, I say that because I know in a community, specifically my Asian identity, there's a lot of controversy with everything that's going on, whether that be Black Lives Matter or COVID-19, with a lot of the racism going around. And sometimes I have to take a step back and challenge my family members, challenge people on Facebook that I know. And it's getting to good trouble because you want to progress. It's getting to good trouble because you want to build bridges. And I keep saying that because I wholeheartedly believe that we need to walk and meet each other halfway. And sometimes to do that, you have to get into waters that you've never had to before, because we're so used to being comfortable. We're so used to staying in our space and not being loud and just making sure that we don't make anybody else uncomfortable either. As for professionally, I really fight for cultural competency and cultural humility. I believe anybody can go into cultural competence training and then come out and say, I'm culturally competent. But that's difficult to talk about because everybody wants to know, like, oh, like now I can do better and be better. However, with cultural competency, it's also important to know that you need to carry that with cultural humility. So that it's not just, oh, I know that you have a harder life than I do. Rather, it's tell me what you are comfortable sharing with me. So let me learn how to help you more. Not so that a person can explain themselves, but a person can express themselves. And sometimes having to build those spaces, you have to challenge people that you never have to before. And so, especially professionally, that is where I will get into good trouble, because I see the bigger picture, and we need to see the bigger picture so that we can make these movements a little bit, and we can, excuse me, I'm stuttering now. We can push ourselves to make these movements like John Lewis has.
That's great. I think speaking up and then inviting people to be in this space and to engage in active listening is important. Sometimes it can be difficult to speak up and confront what some people might consider bigotry, but the Southern Poverty Law Center has a great manual that will tell you how to speak up with family, speak up with friends, speak up in the workplace, all different kinds of settings. So I encourage people to look at that guide, because it helps to have a few phrases that you just have, when that tense situation comes up. It's hard to think it through in the moment. So thank you for that. So thank you. Calling people in, yes, listening and speaking up and confronting them. Great, thank you. Let's see, who's next on my list? Adriana.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about how I would call people in, and I was inspired by what John Lewis shared in the documentary Good Trouble, where he, after his childhood teacher told him, read, child, read. I think, that is a way for people to take action now to continue reading. So we need to acknowledge where we are in this moment in history. We need to acknowledge our legacy of racism, of oppression, and marginalization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And in John Lewis's essay, he did share, and we touched on this earlier, how important our history is to help us find solutions for the challenges of our time. So thank you for bringing that up earlier. He started in the essay, he started his sentence by stating, the truth does not change. And then he said, the answers have been worked out long ago to help you find the solutions to the challenges of our time. So that idea, the truth does not change. I absolutely agree with that statement. And I think we should also question what is widely considered and held to be truth. And we should critically examine the truths of our country, of even our local community, and to be able to confront some of the stories that weren't illustrated, the stories that weren't documented and saved and preserved over time. So I would, in my pursuit to encourage people to read, also encourage them to seek out diverse perspectives and counter narratives. So counter narratives are the stories that go against what are widely held truths and beliefs about our society and our history. And so in people's pursuits of those counter narratives, they should also consider the barriers and systems of oppression that have kept Black people, Indigenous people, and all people of color from being able to publish their stories, their lived experiences, their wisdom, and their brilliant ideas. And so, seeking out the poets in our community, the authors like Gaochi, other people of color that have stories to share and really important, brilliant ideas to share. We have so much of that rich narrative and rich expertise within our own community. So I would encourage people to read, to understand also the emotional labor that they are requesting from their community members of color when they are asking us to share our story with them and share our lived experiences with them and share our wisdom and our brilliant ideas with them. So, I would encourage people to consider the relationships they have when they're asking people to share. Do they have trust in that relationship? Do they have power dynamics that might influence that relationship? And to also consider what they're offering in exchange for that request. And if people still have questions about why they need to offer something in exchange for that labor, I would encourage them to read about the economic injustices that exist across our nation and right here in our own community. So some of those were addressed today in focusing on education, focusing on mental health care and our economic stability. So, you know, it's not as simple, but it includes the fact that we're not paid the same wage as our white counterparts and colleagues, but it is broader. When we use race as a lens, we start to see the inequities that have existed in housing, in healthcare, in access to healthy food and environmental impacts that have kept people of color from having the economic stability and sustainability in our country. So I would encourage them to read, to continue learning more about the systems and structures that were not designed to serve Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. At our Imagine Fox Cities convening on anti-racism and that a lot of us on this panel were a part of organizing, we heard from Dr. Jesus Smith, the Lawrence University professor, as we learned about our legacy, our history of how we've constructed race and whiteness in this country and how messy it was and still is, and how it is pervasive in everything we do. So as much as we aspire to not have race as a determining factor, we can't be colorblind and we can't say that we don't see race, because if we do that, we're going to be limited in what we can actually solve and resolve and reform and change to create an equitable community for all of us. So in my pursuit, in my encouragement to everyone to pursue counter narratives and to continue reading, I want to acknowledge that it is Banned Books Week this week, which is where librarians, booksellers, and other book lovers, educators come together to advocate for intellectual freedom and to denounce censorship around the right to read and access to information. So, you know, our access to information and intellectual freedom is not guaranteed. And, you know, keeping in the spirit of good trouble, I would encourage people to pursue counter narratives, fight for and preserve our intellectual freedom and access to information, and take John Lewis's advice to study and learn our history, the history of our country and our local community.
Well, thank you for that, Adriana. I love that, pursue counter narratives. Thank you. So Karen, what are your closing remarks? How are you?
Yeah, no, go ahead and reframe the question.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you the question again. So how are you going to call people in to engage in good trouble in your community, either on a personal or professional basis?
I am calling people in to make good trouble through the Dignity and Respect campaign being in its third year. I was so moved with the Good Trouble documentary that we watched that John Lewis actually used those words in his speech when they showed the close-up of his speech and what he was asked to change a few words around in it before he delivered his speech on the March on Washington, and how that brings me total joy to know that we are on point with our effort with what Adriana has already shared with the audience tonight, that this third year theme is advancing racial equity through GARE. And GARE is an acronym standing for the Governmental Alliance on Racial Equity, because we have to admit and be upfront with the honesty, truth and reconciliation, if you will, of recognizing the combined crises that we're facing right now of racism and health disparities with COVID-19 at the same time shows us and proves the demonstration of the existence of institutional and structural racism that the government has played a major role in over the years. And I'm just so proud of the fact that in the city of Appleton, we have explicitly decided to focus on race, to change the narrative and move the conversation forward in ways that benefits everyone: gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ, people living with disabilities, etc. Building on the work that we started last year in 2019, even before COVID hit, in December of 2019, a resolution was passed at the Appleton Board of Health, making the recommendation that the city of Appleton declare racism as a health crisis in our city, with complete passage by the Common Council in February of 2020. And then, of course, COVID hit in March. And so we are so proud of the fact that we are now picking up that mantle again. And you can read all about it in the October issue now of Appleton Monthly Magazine that is coming out, will be on store shelves tomorrow morning, October 1st, that's talking about how we are dealing with racism, yet in a health crisis, but that we must move forward to change that narrative.
Great, thank you. That focus on anti-racism, but taking an intersectional approach. So we look at all the dimensions as they relate to race, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, whatever that might be. So thank you, and through the Dignity and Respect campaign. So thank you.
Thank you.
Rayon, how are you going to call people in to do good trouble with you?
Thank you. And for me, it's always remembering the amazing words that was spoken by John Lewis. And so when you see something that is not right, something that is not fair or not just, you have to speak up, you have to say something. But most importantly, what I take from that is that you also have to do something. And for me, what I want to do is to make sure that once I call people in, we're not just going to participate in empty action or empty thoughts. So, you know, while I was thinking about this, I was making a few notes to try to figure out how I will call people in and what I would need to do. And the first thing that I have is, you know, we need to strategize. We need to think before we act and make sure that we know what our next move should be to influence future change. So when we gather, we need to make sure that we have a strategy, we have an intent, we know what we're working towards. When we show up, we also need to show up with a plan. We need to plan effective activities and engage in dialogue with others to get a deeper understanding of what is happening around us. It is not just important for us to stand idly by and to think that because our lives are going well, and we need to assume and make the assumption that others around us, their lives are going well as well. Morgan said something, about the youth sometimes being told that, that they might not need to be engaged. So I also put down here that it's important that we collaborate, right? We partner with those that we're trying to serve, especially people like myself that have some level of influence or sit in rooms that give me an opportunity to have some power to make change. We need to collaborate with those that we're trying to serve and make sure that we include their voices in all levels of the process. And not just always be comfortable to invite the youth or the marginalized members of our community to our table, but when we collaborate, we need to be comfortable to go and sit at their tables. And relinquish whatever power we show up with to make sure that people understand that we're equals in this struggle for justice and in this struggle for social justice. And again, influenced by Morgan, we need to innovate, right? We need to be innovative. We need to be flexible and adapt to the needs of this generation. What we're doing now might not be for us. So we need to think about the youth and we need to think about the future. And we need to make sure that we're using the platforms that is relevant to them and that appeal to them, to make sure that we're engaging with them in a meaningful way and never turn down an idea because it might be too new or too different than what we're used to, right? And lastly, we need to continue to be willing to say something and to do something, but we also need to make sure that we're listening with intent and listening with the intent to act after we take the chance to understand what the needs are around us in order to make the changes that need to happen. And I think John Lewis displayed all of this throughout his life. A lot of the things that we're enjoying today is because of the work and the dedication that he had. And we will continue to enjoy some of these freedoms long after he is, we know that he's no longer with us, and we'll continue to enjoy these freedoms for a long time. So we need to play our role and do our part to make sure that when we're no longer here, we're creating the spaces and the structures to make it more adaptable, more friendly, more welcoming, and to give others a chance to live their full and complete lives at all times. So not just coming together to do stuff, but coming together to make sure that we do things that matters.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. I'd like to share a quote with you from James Baldwin, a very accomplished African-American author and orator. And he says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so I want to thank you all for taking the time this evening to face some of the most significant issues that we are facing as a culture, I would say as a world, related to issues of race and social justice. And so I appreciate your willingness to look with clear-eyed optimism on the challenges that we face together. And I also want to thank our panelists for sharing their wisdom. I know I learned a lot. I hope the folks listening learned a lot and took notes. And so I just want to say good night to everyone and thank you. And I look forward to getting into good trouble with you. Good night.